Now you're telling me you're certain they're going to demand, I think you said based on something Putin said recently, that you think they're going to demand the city of Kharkiv and Odessa, which they have not taken or even tried. Well, they surrounded Kharkiv there for a while, and then the Ukrainians took that land back in September of 22. But they never have gone so far as to do more than hit Odessa. They haven't landed a force there and attempted to take that land at all. But you're saying you think the Russians are going to demand the entire southern coast, including Odessa, in their terms here?
Oh, of course, absolutely. I mean, I think that Russian leaders are remarkably forthright in terms of setting out what they want and what they're willing to do to get it. When Putin in February 2022, in the days leading up to the invasion, he openly stated what Russia's objectives were in Ukraine, which was of course demilitarization, denazification. But this is something that people rather miss is decommunization, and he explicitly stated that Ukraine is pulling down all of these statues of Lenin, and they talk about decommunization. And he said, well, that suits us, but you must not stop halfway. And what he meant by that is that there are historically Russian territories in Ukraine which were given to Ukraine by communist leaders. So like Lenin, Stalin, and Khrushchev all effectively created the modern Ukrainian state. I mean, the very name Ukraine means borderland. Ukraine was the borderland of Russia for centuries, and places like Odessa and Kharkiv are historically Russian. I mean, Zelensky himself couldn't speak Ukrainian before he became president, and there is a large number of people there who see themselves as Russian, and it's one of the reasons that this is perhaps the most widely forecast war in history, because it was well understood that by effectively ending the Soviet Union without any discussion about its borders, of the borders of these new countries that were created by the dissolution of the USSR, that it created all sorts of problems. It effectively created states out of what were administrative units, where arbitrary lines on a map which were related to grain distribution suddenly became binding national borders. This is one of the reasons that the post-Maidan government gave the Kremlin such a fright, was that they immediately, some of their first acts were to rename the road leading up to Baba Yar Stepan Bandera Highway, and also, scrap language rights for Russians, which effectively made an enemy or a discriminated against minority out of something like half the population. There are a great many Ukrainians who speak no other language than Russian, and yes, were born in and grew up in lands that were historically, until very, very recently, in the scheme of things, Russian territory. And so, that objective was set out quite clearly before the war started. In a recent speech, Putin referred to Odessa as historically Russian territory, which is as good a signal as any, as that's what they've got their eyes on. Now, an interesting historical precedent for this, which many people might forget, is that the 1995 Dayton Accords, which brought the Bosnian civil war to a close, in effect, the Bosniaks, the Bosnian Muslims, who the US had been using as a proxy up until that time, and giving and funneling unaccountably vast amounts of weapons and money to in secret and completely illegally, in breach of a UN embargo via CIA black flights. The Bosnian Muslims were expecting the US to effectively back them in the Dayton Accords and give them all of Bosnia's territory and trample over, kind of steamroller over Bosnian Serb and Yugoslav government demands. Right. This belief meant that they refused to engage in peace negotiations throughout the war. There were a number of attempts by the Yugoslav government, by the EU and the UN, to achieve a negotiated settlement, which despite the fact they were losing pretty badly throughout, the Bosnian Muslims refused, because their negotiating position was, we're not giving you an inch, because they thought that NATO bombs would come and then they would get everything they wanted. And as it happened, they got thrown under the bus brutally. The Serbs were given more territory than Slobodan Milosevic considered fair or humane. apart from
including Srebrenica and Zepa, which
Yeah.
in all the previous deals the Muslims got to keep. But in the final deal, nope, the Serbs get them. And including, of course, the horrible massacre, although it wasn't quite as horrible as they embellished, but pretty close in Srebrenica to finish that exchange of territory there. It's just a catastrophe.
Yeah,
I happen to be
exactly.
writing that part of my book right now. It is.
Oh, really? Yeah, but it's just
it's insane.
that's the thing, is that they got they were expecting all sorts of indulgences and support from the US, which wasn't there. And then the US effectively said to them, well, you have no negotiating position. Your economy is just completely trashed, and
we got an election coming up.
Yeah. And you've got an election coming up, so you have to accept everything that we're imposing upon you, or we're just going to pull out the rug from under you and leave you at the mercy of the Serbs. And in the words of one of the Bosniak negotiators, we signed Dayton with a gun to our heads. And it's like, yeah, they had no choice. And it's like, it's exactly the same in Ukraine. Ukraine has been carrying out a silent a campaign of shock therapy neoliberalism at US behest. It has destroyed employment rights for the overwhelming majority of Ukrainians. It has privatized. It has made their country safe for BlackRock and Monsanto, as safe as it can be. Now, in that context, the US it needs at least some Ukrainians still alive to allow the economy to function. And it also probably wants to head off future disputes with Russia. So in that context, I think they would be very forthcoming in terms of what they give the Russians. I've seen many people, again, kind of mock me for suggesting this. If you look at just basic historical precedents, which are very recent, even though nobody's heard of them, of course, the blueprint is there for a mass betrayal. And yes, the Russians have made clear that they're not going to stop fighting until they feel that their demands are met, of course, because this war has been costly for them, but not as costly, anywhere near as costly as the media would have had you believe a few weeks back. Their objectives and their definition of victory has become enlarged, and it's like, I mean, they're already just even the 4 territories that they've formally annexed, and they are going to be holding presidential elections in very, very soon. That's not enough for them yet. It is also, they're sitting on 65% of Ukraine's pre-war GDP, because there's an enormous amount of resources, and there's lots of lithium there and all sorts of like precious metals, and it's not for nothing Ukraine was considered the breadbasket of the Union. Right. So they've got all of that, and Ukraine has nothing. Now, again,
and I'm sorry, we're out of time here, but you're right. I mean, that's always been the question since the war broke out 2 years ago. Are they going to take the whole country, or are they going to leave the land west of the Dnieper River, or they are going to go as far as Odessa or not? And they may have a hell of an insurgency on their hands either way, but hopefully the Americans are heading toward the exits here. But I'm sorry, we're just out of time for the show today. But This is Kit Klarenberg, everybody, at the Grayzone, and he does so much great work over there. You guys have got to keep up with what he's doing. That's thegrayzone.com. Really appreciate your time on the show.
Cheers, Scott. Take care.